15. Deep in the lake, the ancient ship raged. Joy had turned to fear, and then to despair, as the mind touched by, but somehow not prime, fled from its embrace. The semi-sentient neural structure that twined its way through the body of the ship did not understand what had happened. It had been alone in the dark for so long that it had lost all concept of time. It wanted to fly once more, to bond with a prime. The pressure of the liquid black pressed down on it with a fiercer and more malevolent touch now that the ship had tasted the tease of integration, only to have it torn away. Vast pulses of raw psychic anger erupted from the ship, scattering the scaled and finned creatures that called the endless black home. The psychic power panicked the aquatic beasts, and as the waves flowed ever outward, they woke something large and ancient. Something that had swum these waters long before the ship had crashed. The ship only felt the beast for a moment before its limited attention once again sought the other. But the beast had woken, and its powerful muscles pushed it towards the light of the above world. Mirthandir half pulled his sword from the sheath at his waist before Overm placed a hand on the man's wrist. The high elf's eyes snapped from Gryph to the Zidai, and Gryph wondered if the ancient racial hatreds had bubbled to the surface. But then Mirthandir's veneer of acceptance returned, and his eyes snapped back to Gryph. How much of that acceptance is real, and how much is false? Gryph wondered. Explain, Mirthandir said, in a low voice that demanded obedience. Gryph felt the raw power of the Prince Regent's will, and knew that he was accustomed to being obeyed. With a sigh, Gryph told his story. It was not one he liked reliving, but he suspected if he hoped to go on living, wanted his friends to go on living, he had to tell the whole truth. Gryph recapped his battle with the Arbaleth and his taking of the eggs. Overm interjected his own bits to the tale, culminating with the larva's assault on Gryph, Overm's fear that Gryph had become Illyrith, and his decision to kill Gryph. Mirthandir nodded in approval at the adjudicator's decision, and then his eyes met Gryph's. Not the best way to start a friendship, Gryph said, shaking his head with a grin. That brought another surge of pain to his head. I disagree, Mirthandir said. There is no better proof of fellowship than ending another's life before that kind of vile corruption can take a hold. He turned to Overm. Perhaps I was wrong about you. Overm nodded, and Mirthandir snapped his partially drawn sword back into its sheath. The high elf stared towards the approaching shoreline and sighed heavily. An arbaleth hidden in dark places, a prime ship in our waters, the return of the seal. You are a harbinger of ill omens, Gryph. Omens are but warnings of great danger, Tifla said. Would you rather we face that danger without knowing them? No, mistress. I just prefer that we could deal with them one at a time, Mirthandir said. Wick squeezed Tifla's hand lightly, and then gazed into the distance, his eyes going blank as he stared. He was pulled back by the sound of bubbles breaking the surface. The burbling grew fiercer, and his eyes went wide. Guys? The others turned to Wick just as a green tentacle, so dark it was nearly black, erupted from the maelstrom of bubbles and flung itself toward the chthonic summoner. Wick stumbled back, a less than manly squeal erupting from his mouth, as he plopped onto his ass on the bottom of the boat. The tentacle flailed towards the gnome and wrapped itself around his right leg. Wick's hand flew up, and he sent a chthonic bolt flying in the general direction of the creature. The bolt missed, but whatever beast the tentacle belonged to took notice, and the tip of the rubbery appendage split in two, revealing several rows of needle-like teeth. A sound like the desperate shriek of car brakes poured forth from the horrific mouth, and Wick screamed. Wick's eyes widened in terror, and he kicked at the tentacle head with his free boot. The blow did minimal damage, but it got the beast's attention, and a dozen other razor-mouthed tentacles appeared on all sides of the boat. One wrapped itself around the boatman's neck, dragging him from the boat. Mirthandir grabbed the man's arm, but the cord of rubbery muscle was far too strong, and the poor man disappeared into the black of the water. Tifala slashed down with her life-imbued daggers. The tentacle parted under the green energy of the blades, exposing white flesh that reminded Gryph of calamari. The other tentacles howled in an unearthly chorus of pain. They all whipped back below the water, and an odd silence hung over the lake as the boat, no longer possessing its boatman, bounced lightly to a stop. "Is it gone?" Wick demanded, unfurling the severed appendage from his leg. He scowled in disgust and tossed the tentacle overboard. "I very much doubt it," Overham said. "Gryph, I think that breathing spell of yours is about to come in very handy." Gryph's eyes flashed to Overham, and he nodded. "Mirthandir, give me leadership of the adventure party. I have a spell that will help all of us." The Prince Regent eyed Gryph suspiciously. Then something large and strong buffeted the bottom of the idle boat, knocking everyone to their knees. Mirthandir's eyes flashed back to Gryph, and after a short pause, he nodded. "Mirthandir has given Gryph temporary command of the adventure party. This command will last until the current crisis has passed or Mirthandir removes Gryph as adventure party leader. As the adventure party did not originate with Gryph, his boon telepathic bond will not be gifted to all members of the adventure party. The original boon lore boost will remain in effect." The waters calmed, but nobody was foolish enough to think they'd stay that way. They prepared their weapons, and Gryph started casting Halo of Air for the entire group. Normally, the spell required a few simple gestures of the hand, and a rush of air swirled around his head. This time, the motions were much more complex, requiring him to point at each member of the adventure party. "You have cast the air magic spell Halo of Air. As the leader of an adventure party, you can provide Halo of Air to those under your command for an additional mana cost of 1.25 spell cost per person. Total mana cost 144, 30 plus 4 times 37.5 times 0.8. Duration 18 minutes, 5 plus 1 per level of air magic mastery. Do you wish to cast? Yes, no." Gryph hit yes, and he felt mana pour into the spell. A globe of solid air formed around all 5 of the Fellowship's heads. The mana cost had been high, but none of them would drown, at least not for the next 18 minutes. Another, more forceful blow hit the boat. "We need to jump from the boat in opposite directions. Then we can encircle this beast and come at it from all sides," Mirthandir yelled. "You want us to go into the water?" Wick exclaimed incredulously. "He's right. This thing will topple the boat any moment, and we'll all be concentrated in one place. Easy pickings for this water devil," Overham said. "Ah, I hate all of ya!" Wick said, and grabbed his mop of blue hair and tugged in frustration. A moment later, a large beak bit into the enchanted wood of the boat, and the serrated chitin of the creature's main mouth tore at it. Wick's eyes went wide, and then he looked at Gryph and nodded. As one, the entire group jumped from the boat and swam. Gryph dove as a tentacle snapped at him. Halo of air had saved his bacon more than once in the Barrow, and an unpleasant flash of déjà vu punched him in the brain as he swam down. He spun, his eyes adjusting to the dark water. He could see Wick and Tifla to his left and Mirthendir to his right. Over was nowhere to be seen, but he suspected the giant sea monster was shielding the able warrior monk from his view. The creature looked like a bus-sized starfish, with dozens of thin tentacles protruding from each of 5 short stumps connected to the beast's body. The creature's central core was a pentagonal shape that reminded Gryph of the natural sponges that grew on reefs in the Caribbean. 5 large eyes surrounded a beak-like maw, and the whole body was ensconced in a giant conch shell. He used Analyze. Denizen of the Deep, Level 43, H 2211, S 2234, M 876, SP 0. Denizens of the deep are among the most ancient and deadly water monsters to lie in the deep watery places of Corin. They are believed to be remnants of ancient experiments merging spirits from the realm of water with native crustaceans. They grow throughout their lives, and a careful observer can use the layers of growth on their main shell to determine their age. That is, of course, if one can get close enough to inspect it without getting eaten. They are simple-minded omnivores prone to fits of uncontrolled rage, a product of once intelligent water spirits being bonded with animals with very low cranial capacity. Due to their ancient bond with these water elementals, they can instinctively cast simple water-based magical attacks. Strengths unknown. Immunities unknown. Weaknesses unknown. Great. Another water death monster, Gryph thought. He sent a burst of mana into his bracers. They bore intricate scrollwork of the rare metal yellow elementum that gave Gryph a modicum of magnetic control over anything made of ferrous metal. He gripped his spear in a light but firm grasp and tapped into the item's mana reserve. He'd learned the hard way to always power up the staff's reserves when he was not in a battle situation. Essentially, it acted like a battery that allowed him to store 200 points of mana. With his native pool, the artifact's power gave him over 500 points of spellcasting or weapon-powering might. While he was dying to try out Yiriel's icon, he suspected that sending massive amounts of electrical energy surging through the water was probably not the best option. However, the war staff's penetrating damage power was a perfect option. To his left, a scorching beam of crimson light rumbled through the water and punched into the denizen, where one of the thick masses of tentacles met the body. Several of the tentacles sheared off, and the beast shuddered in pained fury. Nice work, Wick, Gryph thought. Mirthendir thrust forward with his staff, and a lance of blue-white light shot towards the creature. It zipped through the water, dragging a shining chain of icy links behind it. It impacted the denizen right below the snapping beak and sunk home. The barbs on the lance held fast, and Gryph grinned as he realized what the Prince Regent had done. He harpooned the bastard. Mirthendir pulled back hard on the chain of ice, but the beast was in its element, and the elf could not get any purchase. The denizen wrapped several tentacles around the elf lord's waist and dragged him towards its mouth. Mirthandir let one hand slip from his staff, and he cast again. Damn, he is strong, Gryph thought. Magical light flowed around the elf, and the lower half of his body transmogrified from legs into a mass of fin-laden tentacles. The appendages gyrated, and Mirthandir not only arrested his motion, but managed to pull back against the denizen's strength. Tifala finished her intricate casting, and a small fissure in reality opened between the gnome life-master and the denizen. Emerald light poured from the fissure, and then a mass of vines pushed their way from the slit, like a mass of green spaghetti being birthed. The vines wrapped themselves around the denizen. Not only did they tangle dozens of the beast's tentacles, they also worked in concert with Mirthandir's attack to partially immobilize the monster. They tugged the creature in both directions, and it slowly turned its hard-shelled back to Gryph. Gryph had no idea how they'd coordinated their attack, or if they even had, but it gave Gryph an idea. He unfurled the length of spider silk rope from his waist and cast Animate Rope. One end of the rope tied itself around his waist, and the other hung like a water snake, ready to strike. He tapped the stored mana and pumped it into penetrating strike. He then activated his bracers. Every other time he'd used the magnetic power of his bracers, it had been to add further power to a strike or to retrieve his weapon from a safe distance. This time, he had a new idea. He forced a magnetic charge through the bracers and into the spear, but this time he did not let go. The spear surged forward, and it pulled Gryph along like a man on water skis. An unexpected war cry erupted from him as he surged towards the creature's back. He aimed the adamantine tip at one of the striated lines that curved along the creature's shell. If it was like a conch shell, he hoped that spot was thinner and weaker. He activated his Impale perk a second before impact. The spear punched through the denizen's shell with a crunching snap, and the tip broke through the shell. Gryph heaved with all his might, twisting and digging the spear deeper into the denizen's body. Even muted by the water, it sounded like a titan cracking a giant lobster shell for dinner. The denizen bucked in shock and agony, and Gryph barely held on. He ordered the rope to twine itself around the beast, wrapping around two of the tentacles and the shell. The beast whipped one of its multi-pronged arms back towards Gryph as he rode the beast like a champion rodeo rider. Ahead, Ovrim flailed wildly, his saber spinning in arcs of calculated death. Gryph saw the fear in his friend's eyes and suspected it was as much a fear of drowning as of the beast he faced. Despite this, the Zidai's aim was true, and a dozen tentacles floated around him, leaking brackish ichor into the water. The Zidai slashed again, but the water slowed his movements, and this time a tentacle slipped around Ovrim's defenses and wrapped about his ankle. Gryph saw the Zidai's eyes go wide in fear. Then the denizen spasmed and whipped the Zidai end over end at Gryph. He tried to move out of the path of the man-sized missile, but moving in water was not like moving on land, and Gryph's reaction was slow and ponderous. Ovrim smashed into Gryph's side, and the sound of several ribs cracking came to both men's ears. Gryph felt a spike of pain, and his spear slipped from his grasp. The two men flew end over end, away from the denizen. Gryph's health dipped by 5%. Gryph grabbed onto Ovrim's forearm just as they reached the limit of Gryph's rope. Their motion came to a jarring stop, and both men grunted as the strain threatened to rip arms from their sockets. Ovram's eyes edged on terror, and Gryph knew he had to help his friend. He cast Mind Shield, a spell ironically taught to him by Ovram, and he saw the adjudicator's yellow eyes calm. Gryph tried to ask the man if he was okay, but the sound that pulsed through the halo of air became a jumbled mess. On a whim, Gryph moved his head closer to Ovram's, and when the two spheres of air met, Gryph could hear the man's ragged breathing. "Easy, man," Gryph said, and reached a hand up to grip the Zidai by the back of the neck. Gryph saw control and calm come to Ovram. "Thank you," he said. "What now?" "I have a plan," Gryph said, his lips curling into a grin. "Why do I think I will hate your plan? Because you've spent too much time with Wick." Gryph explained his idea, and Ovram grumbled, but nodded. They pulled away from each other, separating their halos. Ovram positioned himself behind Gryph and grabbed his belt and the back of his breastplate. Gryph then ordered the rope around his waist to pull them forwards, and they hurtled through the water back towards the denizen. As the water rushed by them, Gryph checked on the others. Mirthandir was a blur. His tentacle-laden lower half gave him much greater maneuverability than any of his fellows. Why didn't he make that his boon? The tall elf still clutched his ice harpoon and zipped just out of the denizen's reach, casting wave after wave of icy spikes. They seemed to do little or no damage to the creature, but at least they were keeping its attention. Tifila was sending a stream of green light into her summoned vines. Each time the denizen snapped or severed a root, another burst from the throbbing mass to latch onto the beast. Gryph knew that the gnome's mana had to be close to bottoming out, and when that happened, her vines would disappear. Wick's chthonic bolts seemed much more effective. Did the creature have a weakness to chthonic magic? "We're running out of time," Gryph thought. They were halfway to their target when a pulse of light flashed from the denizen's body and down all 5 tentacle arms. The arms began to spasm and shake, and the rope Gryph had used to immobilize several of the tentacles snapped. Gryph had no time to mourn the loss as waves of high-speed water pummeled into Gryph. He felt like he'd run full force into a brick wall, and his health bar dipped. Gryph saw a flash of motion in front of him and barely dodged a large chunk of the beast's shell. Whatever magical attack it had just unleashed had dislodged part of the beast's chitinous armor, damaged by Gryph's spear. The chunk of shell scraped his neck as it moved past, and Gryph heard a muffled grunt of pain as it hit Ovram in the face. The Zidai lost his grip on Gryph's back and was flung backwards head over heels, his dead weight dragging him deeper into the black deep. "Ovram!" Gryph yelled, and knew even if the Zidai was still conscious, he could not hear him. Without hesitation, Gryph ordered the remaining rope to unfurl from his waist and rush after the warrior monk. "Bring him to the surface," Gryph thought at the rope, hoping the length of animated spider silk was aware enough to understand. He watched the rope zip after the adjudicator, looking for all the world like a silver-scaled water snake. Sending a silent plea to the universe to protect his friend, Gryph turned back towards the battle. Wick and Tifila had stopped casting and clumsily swum backwards to get away from the denizen's much more agile attacks. Mirthandir was still on the attack, but he may as well have been a swarm of gnats for all the damage he was doing. Things were not looking good. Then they got worse. A crimson flash pulsed into Gryph's vision, a 1-minute countdown before Halo of Air failed, and they all started drowning. Gryph tried to cast the spell again, but got a flared warning telling him he was too far away from the members of the adventure party. "Shit!" Gryph raged, and watched as his outburst passed through the sphere of air to become useless bubbles. The same panic seemed to grip his friends, and both Wick and Tifla's distraction allowed several of the denizens' tentacles to wrap themselves around the two gnomes. Gryph saw their screams, made all the more eerie for not being able to hear them, and then he saw rivulets of blood leak into the water. Another tentacle arm slashed towards Mirthandir, and a dozen tooth-edged filaments wrapped around the Prince Regent. He drew his sword and hacked several in half before another half-dozen of the appendages slithered up and around his arm. They squeezed, and the elf lost his grip on the sword, which disappeared into the dark depths. The denizen pulled all three of his friends towards it, and Gryph knew he had mere moments before one of them became fish food. He was the only one left free, and he had no rope and no weapon. His eyes flashed to his spear, still protruding from the beast's shell like a flagstaff claiming dominion of a new continent for a great empire. Gryph grinned and pumped mana into his bracers. He reached out, felt the tug of metal from his spear, and gently pulled. The pace was agonizing, but Gryph dared not put more force into the spear for fear he'd rip his anchor free. The denizen dragged Tifla towards the front of its body, and Gryph lost sight of her. From Wick's terrified reaction, he could see everything that was about to befall her. The gnome flailed desperately and slashed the tentacle with his dagger, nicking himself as often as he cut the tentacle. Gryph pushed more of his will into the bracers and tugged harder. He had no choice. Tifla was just about out of time. He saw the shaft of his spear shake. He was dislodging it much faster than he'd hoped. Gryph turned his body into a missile, hoping to reduce the drag of the water. His speed increased, and he stretched his hand out, grasping towards the shaft of his weapon. He felt the shaft and grabbed hard, but could not entirely arrest his motion, and impacted the shell with terrific force, knocking the air from his lungs. Gryph lost consciousness.